My name is Randy. I'm one of the associate ministers here at Eagle Christian Church. And over the last several months, we've been studying through the New Testament book of 1 Peter. This is the Apostle Peter's letter to New Testament Christians who have been dispersed to a part of the world that we know as Turkey. And the reason they've been dispersed is because of their faith in Jesus Christ. You see, these are Christians who have lost their jobs, who have been driven from their homes, who have been alienated from their families because of their very faith in Jesus Christ. Peter is writing to Christians who are asking themselves the very real question, how important is my faith in Christ? And in addition to that question, they're also asking questions like, if my faith is important, how am I to live it out in this world? How am I to live as a Christian in a very anti-Christian or ungodly society? And they're really asking the question, if my faith is important, how long am I going to be able to hang on to it as I live in this world? You see, Peter writes to encourage those kinds of Christians with those kinds of questions. And Peter is the right guy to do it because I believe that Peter lived through and wrestled with some of those same questions during his life. During our time together today, I want you to hear from the Apostle Peter himself. I want you to hear about his life and his interaction with Jesus and his story of his time there with Christ. But more important than that, I want you to hear to his wrestling. I want you to hear as he comes to terms with the fears that he has about opposition to Christ and his commitment to Jesus. I want you to hear from Peter himself as he tells you his story.
I'm Peter. That's the name that Jesus gave me. My family, my friends, they know me as Simon. And I've spent the last 3 years with Jesus. And during that time, I've seen some incredible things. Some things that no other person has been able to do. But more important than that, I heard a message from Jesus about God, about how he agapes mankind, how he loves us completely and how he loves us perfectly, and he loves us without condition. I didn't always understand really what that message of love meant for me. I didn't know that it was really real throughout my life, but I came to understand that his love was calling me to be something different. His love was calling me to become something different with my life. Before I get ahead of myself, I suppose I should maybe give you some background and maybe even just start at the very beginning. I was born into a typical Hebrew family. We worked hard to honor the Sabbath and to follow the law of Moses. I can remember from an early age, we would go to the synagogue every Sabbath, and we would listen to the rabbi as he read through the Torah. But I struggled. As he was reading through, I found myself wandering. I found my mind taking me to the place that I loved, out on the lake, and catching fish out there. As far as following the law of Moses, I wasn't very good at doing that either. I'd wake up in the morning and I would be determined that I wanted to follow the law and that I was going to do it perfectly the way that God had commanded. But before long, I found myself tempted to lie to my family about where I've been and what I've been doing. And more than that, I found myself tempted to deceive my brother so that I could get my very own way. In fact, for most of my life, I think I failed more than I succeeded when it came to following the law of Moses. In fact, I became pretty good at picking out the sacrificial lamb that we used to cover our sin. When I wasn't at the synagogue or when I wasn't hanging out with my family, I could be found out on the Lake of Gennesaret, or the Sea of Galilee, as some called it. You see, my family was in the fishing business. My father was a fisherman, and his father before him was a fisherman, and his father was a fisherman. All of my brothers were fishermen, and without being too boastful, we were actually pretty good fishermen. We had all the right equipment, and more than that, we knew where to go on the lake to get the biggest catch. And so that's what we did. Every day we'd go out and we'd fill our nets with fish, and we'd bring them back to the shore. We'd pick out some that we wanted to keep for food for our family, and then the rest we'd take to the marketplace. Man, it was a great life. I loved being a fisherman. It was the thing that brought me pleasure and brought me satisfaction. Gave me the ability to really provide for my family. The only thing that I didn't really like about it was this fact that the Romans came around. And they required us to pay taxes to support their pagan government. Oh, I despised the Romans. I hated them. In fact, there was nothing worse than them being Roman. They were rude and they were crude and they were really disrespectful to me and to my way of life. They built pagan temples among us and they discouraged us from following the law of Moses. I despised them. I hated them for the things that they were doing. But the worst thing that they were doing was they were coming to us and requiring us to pay taxes. And more than that, they even recruited some of my fellow countrymen, some people that I used to call friends, to do their dirty work for them, to be their tax collectors. You know, I said there's nothing worse than being Roman. Well, except for maybe volunteering to go to work for them. You know, from an early age, I was told that one day God's promised Messiah would come into our world and things would change. He would deliver us from those who would oppress us, who would force us into their way of life. You know, I remember the day that my brother Andrew came running up to me and he said, "Hey, we found the Messiah. We found the Christ." Now, Andrew had been spending some time with this guy named John, and John was a little different. He had been talking about a message of repentance, and he'd been talking about how the kingdom of God was at hand. He'd been out in the countryside, and he'd been baptizing people in the rivers and the lakes. And when Andrew came and said, "We found the Messiah," I was more than a little bit skeptical. I was thinking, yeah, right. This guy, John, that you're hanging out with has found the Messiah. I wasn't sure. After a little bit of persuasion, though, I decided that I would go and I would check out this guy, Jesus, for myself. My first impression of Jesus was that he was warm, and he was kind, and he was thoughtful. He was humble. He had this quiet strength about him. And more than that, he spoke with this amazing authority. You know, it was in this first encounter with Jesus that he looked at me and he gave me the name Peter. It's a name that means stone, or more specifically, maybe a little stone, kind of like a pebble. I wasn't quite sure what this new name was all about, but I liked Jesus. Although I wasn't sure if he was the Messiah, at least not yet. You see, I wasn't convinced until Jesus took me fishing. I remember the day that it happened. Me and my partners, James and John, had been out all night, and we had worked hard, and we had caught absolutely nothing. You know, the only thing worse than not catching fish is staying up all night and not catching fish. It was a discouraging night, and we were tired, and we were hungry, and we wanted to go home, and we wanted to get some rest. I remember we were over washing out our nets on the shore, and Jesus showed up. And there were a bunch of people that had followed him from town, and he was beginning to teach them. And as he was teaching them, they were pressing in around him. So Jesus looked over at me, and he motioned, and so I went and gave him a hand. He jumped into my boat, and we rowed out about 20 feet from the shore, and Jesus sat on the bow of my boat and began to teach the people. He spoke about God, and he spoke about righteousness. He spoke like no one I had ever heard before. And he had authority. He knew what he was talking about. And I was drawn into his message. In fact, I was so drawn in that I completely forgot about the discouraging night that we'd had out on the lake. And more than that, I completely forgot about the exhaustion that my body was now experiencing. But you know, Jesus' next statement brought both of those realities back into focus. You see, Jesus looked right at me and said, "Hey, Peter, let's go fishing." Oh, that was the last thing I wanted to do at that point. I was hungry. I was tired. I wanted to get some sleep so that I could come back the next night and make up for what we didn't catch the night before. But Jesus just looked at me. And I know that he didn't really understand fishing, and so I tried to be gentle. But I think I came across a little more than abrupt. I said, "Master, we've worked hard all night long and we've caught nothing." At that, I was hoping that Jesus would relent and he'd step out of the boat and we'd be able to pack our gear and go home. But again, Jesus just looked at me. with those big eyes and that warm smile that seemed to communicate to me without words, hey, Peter, just trust me. Let's go fishing. Let's see what's out there. Just trust me. And so before long, I found myself rowing out into the deep part of the lake. And I half-heartedly threw my nets over the side, expecting absolutely nothing to happen. Well, I couldn't have been more wrong. See, what happened next was incredible. It was miraculous. My nets immediately began to fill with fish, so full that they began to break. And as I struggled to pull in that catch of fish, I realized that I couldn't do it on my own. So I yelled over at my partners, James and John, hey, come on out here and give me a hand. I've got some fish. They jumped into their boat and they came out, and as we struggled to bring in the catch, we realized that there was enough in these nets to fill both of our boats completely full. So full that we didn't even have a place to sit. And more than that, the weight of the fish caused the boats to sit low in the water, so low that the water began to fill our boats, and we began to sink. I had never seen a catch of fish like that in my entire life. I had never even heard of somebody having that big of a catch before. And immediately, I realized who this Jesus was. I realized that he was the Messiah. He was the one who had come from God, who was to redeem my people. He was the one who had come that we had been waiting for such a long time. He was the one who was going to rescue us. And as that thought washed over me, I realized that I was in the presence of greatness and that I was a sinner. I was not worthy to be in the boat with Jesus. And so I said the only thing that I could think of, Jesus, depart from me, for I'm a sinful man. But you know, Jesus just looked at me. And I remember what he said. He said, Peter, it's okay. Don't be afraid. From now on, you're going to catch men. Now, I had absolutely no idea what that meant. I didn't know what he was talking about. But here's what I did know. I did know that Jesus was the Messiah. I knew that I wanted to spend time with him. I knew that I wanted to follow him. So I did the only thing that I could think of to do. I pulled my boat up to the shore, and I left everything, and I followed him. For the next couple of years, we saw Jesus do incredible things. He healed the blind with spit and dirt. He made the lame walk again. He cleansed the lepers and healed the sick. He did incredible things. He did things that only someone from God could do. But more important than that was his message. He spoke about God, and he spoke about righteousness, and he called us to the things that our hearts were yearning for, to have a relationship with God, to make it more about that relationship than just following the law. You know, Jesus calmed storms, and he even walked on water. I remember the time that he came to us at night, walking on the water. We didn't know if it was Jesus until we called out to him. And as he spoke, he actually asked me to come out on the water and join him. And so I did. I stepped out of the boat, and sure enough, I was walking on water. It was incredible. It was amazing. But then I began to be filled with fear because the waves were rising. And I was afraid that I was going to sink, that I was going to drown. And as soon as that thought came into my mind, sure enough, I began to sink. And I yelled out to Jesus to help me, and he reached down and he rescued me. You know, I remember the time that Jesus approached us and he asked us, not just any question, but I believe he asked us the question. He came to us and he said, who do people say that I am? And of course, we had heard people talking about who they thought Jesus was. And so some of the disciples chimed in and they said, well, we've heard that some people say that you're John the Baptist, or others are saying that you're Elijah or Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And Jesus just looked at us and he said, yeah, I've heard. That's what other people are saying. But how about you? Who do you say that I am? I immediately stood up and I looked right at Jesus and I said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." You see, I was convinced that he was the one. He was the Messiah. He was the real deal because of the things that I had seen, the things that I had experienced in my time with Jesus. I remember Jesus looked at me and he said, "Blessed are you." Because that wasn't revealed by men, but it was revealed by my Father who was in heaven. And then he went on and he talked about how he was going to build his ecclesia. He was going to build his church upon the rock of that statement, that he was the Christ, the Son of the living God. And he went on and he said he's going to give us the keys of the kingdom. I don't know everything that Jesus meant when he was saying those things, but I was convinced that Jesus was it. Or at least I thought I did. I remember our last meal together. It was at that meal where some things that Jesus said and did really made me a little bit uncomfortable. You see, we were in an upper room in a home in Jerusalem, and me and the other disciples were reclining around the table, and Jesus shows up. And he's dressed like a servant. And he's got this basin of water, and he's got a towel. And he begins to wash feet. It's the strangest thing. I didn't have any idea what this meant. I knew that Jesus was the Messiah. I knew that he was the Son of God. But here he was washing feet. And he washed Matthew's feet and John's feet and Philip's feet. He even washed Judas' feet. And when he came to me, I refused. Because I knew I was a sinner. I knew that Jesus was the Messiah, that I should be washing his feet, not him washing me. And so I said, "Jesus, you're not going to wash my feet." And he looked at me and he said, "Peter, if I don't wash your feet, you can't have any part of what I'm doing. You can't belong." Well, I knew that I was committed. I knew that I wanted to belong. So I said, "Jesus, don't just wash my feet then, wash all of me. Because I am in 100%. I want to follow you. And I am committed to you." A little later during that meal, he took some bread and he broke it. And he talked about how this bread represents his body that's going to be broken. And he took some wine and we all drank of it. And then he talked about how that wine was a picture of his blood that was going to be shed. And he talked about a new covenant. Now, we didn't really understand what Jesus was talking about. But that wasn't really anything new because Jesus said all kinds of things that we really had a hard time wrapping our minds around. Like the time that he talked about destroying the temple and rebuilding it in 3 days. I mean, what was that really all about? One of the most difficult things that I experienced during that time with Jesus that night was when he told me that I was going to deny him 3 times by morning. I thought Jesus was crazy. I was committed. I wanted to follow him forever. I wanted to be close to him. I believed that he was the Messiah, the one who had come from God. How was I going to deny him 3 times in the next 12 hours? It was impossible. Or at least that's what I thought at the moment. See, I didn't really know what was going to transpire later that night. You see, after the meal, we went out to the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. And we had done that before. And I got to tell you, it was getting late. And I was tired. And as Jesus prayed, we tried to stay awake, but we kept nodding off. Jesus came back a couple of times and woke us up and reminded us how important it was for us to watch and to pray. We didn't really understand why that was important, but it was. You see, a little bit later, there was a group of people that came into the garden. There were soldiers, and there were Jewish officials. There were scribes and Pharisees that had come into the garden, and our friend Judas was with them. In fact, Judas was leading them. They came into the garden, and Judas led them right up to Jesus. And then Judas did the most curious thing. He leaned forward and he kissed Jesus on the cheek. Immediately when that happened, the soldiers surrounded Jesus, and I knew what was going on. They were there to arrest Jesus. You see, These people hated Jesus. They hated his message. And they were there to arrest him, to keep him quiet. Well, I wasn't going to let that happen. So I did the only thing I could think to do. I grabbed a sword of one of the nearby soldiers and I started swinging at people. And I cut off the ear of this servant of the high priest. And I thought, this is perfect. Now Jesus can get away. I've created a diversion, a distraction. And Jesus can now get away and he can run, he can hide, so he won't be arrested. But to my bewilderment, Jesus didn't run. He didn't do the thing that I would have done. In fact, he stooped down on the ground and grabbed this guy's ear, and he put it back up on his head, and he healed him. Wow. Jesus had healed the very people that had come to arrest him. Well, they took Jesus that night from the garden, and of course the disciples, we scattered. But I was curious. I wanted to know where they were going to take Jesus. And maybe more than that, I was curious to see how Jesus was going to show up and do what he always did, which was the incredible, the miraculous. How Jesus was going to call down bolts of lightning from heaven to destroy those who would come to arrest him. So I followed from a distance, and they took him to Caiaphas' house. And the Sanhedrin was there, and they took him inside, and they questioned him. And pretty soon the questioning turned to beating. And they began to hit him and strike him with their fists and with sticks. And I didn't understand everything that was taking place. And I began to wonder, is Jesus really who I thought he was? I mean, if he's going to rescue and redeem Israel, it's definitely not going to look like this. And I began to doubt everything that he had told us over the last 3 years. And as I began to doubt, this wave of fear welled up within me. And I was consumed with this fear because I knew that if they took Jesus, that they might come and take me too. And from out of nowhere, this young servant girl came up and she said, "Hey, you, aren't you one of Jesus' followers?" And in my fear and in my doubt, I said the only thing I could think to say. And I said, "No, I don't know him. I have no idea who he is." In my fear, I began to think that maybe I was a little bit too close. So I moved out of that courtyard into an outer courtyard. And as I was doing that, another person confronted me and said, "Hey, you, weren't you with Jesus?" And I began to swear on an oath, "No, I don't know this Jesus," as fear and doubt consumed me. A little bit later, a group of people came up and they pointed to me and they started to say, "No, we know that you were with Jesus because your accent gives you away. We know that you were with him." And my fear and my doubt turned into rage and anger, and I began to swear and curse and call down and say, "I don't know the man. I don't know what you're talking about." And as immediately as I said that, the rooster crowed. It was morning. And I remembered what Jesus had told me the night before. That I wouldn't deny him just once or twice, but 3 times I would deny that I even knew him. I immediately felt shame. I immediately felt failure. I immediately felt guilt. And in those feelings, I did the only thing that I could think to do. I ran and I hid and I wept bitterly. I wept because did I really believe that Jesus was who he said he was? Did I really come to understand him the way that he had portrayed himself? Was he really the Christ? Was he really the Messiah? I didn't know any longer. The rest of that day was kind of a blur. You see, Jesus was taken before Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, and he was condemned to die by crucifixion. They led him to Golgotha. They nailed him to a cross. And he died. And I was a mess. the man who had healed the sick, the man who had made the lame walk again, the man who had command over the elements of the earth, the man who had called Lazarus forth out of the grave was dead. And along with his death were all of my hopes and all of my dreams about what Jesus was supposed to do, about how he was to deliver us from these dirty, filthy Romans. The next few days were horrible. Judas went out and hung himself, and the rest of the disciples and I, we got together and we hid out. We were afraid that the Romans and that the Jews were going to come and they were going to arrest us, and we would be hung on a cross next. We huddled in a house with the doors locked and the windows closed. The nights were long. We didn't get any sleep. As we tried to process in our minds what had transpired over the last few days and who Jesus really, really was. Sunday morning comes around and we hear this faint knock on the door. And again, we're concerned that maybe it's the Romans and maybe the Jews, maybe they found where we're at. But as we peeked outside, we noticed that it was Mary. And Mary was frantic, and so she came in and she talked about how she had been out to the tomb where Jesus had been laid and how the stone had been rolled away. And she talked about how Jesus' body was not there, that his body had been taken. Well, I looked at John and John looked at me, and we both had the same thought. We need to see this for ourselves. So putting our fear aside, we ran to the tomb that morning. And John got there first, but I went in as soon as I got there. And John and I, as we both went into the tomb, we noticed that Jesus' body was gone. But the interesting thing was the burial linens were still there. You see, if somebody had taken his body, they had unwrapped it first and left the burial linens. And this was curious. And John and I were perplexed. What had really happened? What was really going on in that tomb? Well, later that day, it became clear exactly what had happened. We were again in the house, and we had the doors and the windows bolted and closed. And we were still trying to figure out everything that had transpired. And we were talking about Jesus, and was he really the Messiah? What were we going to do next? When the most amazing thing happened. We were standing there, we were talking, and lo and behold, who shows up? Jesus comes into the room. Now, when I say Jesus came into the room, he didn't use the door, he didn't come in through a window, he was just there. And immediately we knew what had happened in the tomb. Jesus was alive. Jesus had conquered the grave. He had overcome death. We were happy. We were amazed. We were astonished. We were overwhelmed because Jesus was alive. Jesus was among us. Jesus talked about his love for us. He talked about mercy and grace, forgiveness, and peace. The very things that we needed to hear. The very things that caused our fear and our doubt to go away from us because Jesus was alive. He talked a lot about his plan. He talked a lot about what he was calling us to become and be with our lives. Over the next few weeks, it was awesome. We spent time with Jesus. We went fishing. We shared meals together. It was an incredible experience to be with Jesus because we believed for sure that he was the Messiah. He had come from God. He had died and he had rose again. He was alive today and forevermore. And I resolved that I would never allow fear, that I resolved that I'd never allow doubt to overcome me and cause me to be the very person that I did not want to be. I would never again deny Jesus. I would never again deny that he was my master. Today is the day of Pentecost. It's been 50 days since the Passover and since the time when Jesus was crucified and rose again. We're going to go down to the temple a little bit later today to celebrate God's goodness. You see, Jesus is no longer with us. We actually watched as he rose into the air, but as he rose into the air, he told us that we were going to be his witnesses, that we were going to tell his story and our story of our interaction with him. He told us that we were going to go and baptize people in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. He breathed out his Spirit on us. And today, I don't know what's going to happen in the temple. I have no idea what's really going to take place. But here's what I know. If someone asks me if I know Jesus, if someone asks me if I am an associate of his, if someone asks me to tell my story, I'm going to stand up. And I don't care if it's 1 or 10 or 1,000 people, I'm going to proclaim proudly and loudly that Jesus is the Messiah, that he really did die and he really did raise from the dead to reign forevermore. He is my master. I don't know what that's going to look like in my life as I live it out, but that one thing I am convinced of. I am going to be his witness.
There was an incredible change that took place in Peter's life. In Acts chapter 2, we read that it was Peter who stood up among the disciples. And it was Peter who preached the very first gospel sermon in the temple that day, and 3,000 people responded. You see, Peter struggled in his life, and he struggled with a lot of fear surrounding Jesus and his commitment to follow Jesus and what that would mean for him in his life. But the most important thing that I want you to realize from our time together today, that it was the resurrection that clinched it for Peter. You see, the thing that happened between his denial and his preaching 50 days later in the temple and proclaiming proudly the fact that he knew Jesus and what Jesus was all about, the difference was he had experienced the resurrection personally in his life, and it changed him. My prayer, my goal for us as a church, as a congregation, is that we too would realize the power of the resurrection, that it would be the thing that clinches it in our lives and removes all fear as we continue to follow Christ and do the things that he's called us to do.